going back to this. Now, what we've got here is, like I said, I can't quite remember if I used this template last year when we did the colour class. Did anyone who attended that class, anyone remember that, the Munsell value scale? Ah, right. Okay, so this is brand new and fresh, right? So the file that I've given you is kind of my preferred setup or my preferred file type for creating any kind of story arc. Now that can be loose concepts that I may then turn into larger visual development paintings, so that, you know, as a practitioner outside of education, that's kind of what I do, is visual development art. But it's also a good one for more structured storyboarding. To give you a bit of kind of detailed properties information, the file itself, so this whole window here is 5,000 by 5,000 pixels. The background is exactly 50% in terms of value, so it's exactly, it's like perfect grey, exact grey. The two rectangles here, which are listed as frames down here, they are exactly 1920 by 1080 pixels. So they're full HD frame. So whatever I'm drawing within those frames, I know that compositionally, that is the same ratio as an HD TV. That's how it would look once it's animated and you know, animated in HD and up on the screen. So that's just kind of good practice to get into. There's a tiny little piece of me that dies every time I see someone doing a storyboard in a square box. That really hurts me, because it's that no one watches square televisions ever. So your work can only ever be wrong if you do that. But this is a good kind of practice to get into. There is a rationale behind the grey, which we'll get into in a little bit. Down on the right-hand side, you've got 3 sets of layers. So you've got a canvas layer, just here. So the canvas contains the Munsell values, which we'll get into, the perfect grey, and that's all nicely encapsulated in a little folder. We have a top frame, and I've even left you instructions there that it says frames, add layers behind this. Yeah, so work below that, and you'll see that I've locked them both and then left you a blank layer in the middle. So it's not a nice kind of template frame. Whenever you're going to start a piece of work, it's nice to have a file that just allows you to begin, and you don't have to worry about the setup and the structural stuff before you start. Let's get into this up here, this value scale. Now, when we design for animation, or for film, in fact, and now even more so in the last 10 years for computer games, drawing lines and drawing composition just as lines and shapes is no longer enough. Okay, it's not good enough. It doesn't provide the information that animators, lighting artists, texture artists, you know, no one can work with line drawings. We need to understand in greater detail the dimensions and the depth and the emotion, in fact, and the genre of what it is we're going to animate. So we have to go beyond line drawings. We have to start thinking in terms of depth. And the best way to establish depth is to use values. When we use the term values, what we mean by that is the scale as it exists from perfect black to perfect white. Okay, so what we've got here is the Munsell value scale. Is a very clever data scientist who then became a colour analyst. And David Briggs is also a colour analyst and photographer who produced this. But the idea of the Munsell value scale is it shows us kind of a breakdown of 10 stages as they exist between darkest dark and lightest light. So what it does is it allows us to kind of see how those would each be presented when placed against a different background. So these two greys are almost identical. I shifted this one, so this is 50%, this one is actually 52%. So I made it ever so slightly lighter, just so you could see that it was its own object. But we can see how black through to white look against grey. This is 91, I think, or 89 actually. I think it's 89 to white. So it's almost pure white, but not quite there. And I did that so that you could see pure white as a square. And we can see how those values exist against a light background. And then we've got 1, so 0, 0, 1, so almost perfect black, and then perfect black rested against it. And the reason that this is a good thing to have is, first off, it allows us to very quickly pick the 9 sort of middle stages of the scale. So using the eyedropper tool, we can very quickly just grab those right values and use them as we need them within the drawing. So as a reference tool, it's great to have. It's like having your own little painting palette sitting right there that can't go wrong. It's almost the same as what a lot of background like matte painters and viz dev artists use, which is the swatches. I don't know, does anyone use swatches in Photoshop? They're awesome. It's like your own permanent paint palette that never changes. It is what you need it to be. A lot of people tend to use this thing up here, and it's just awful. Picking the same color twice at random on this is almost impossible. So yeah, it's really inconsistent, and what's far more consistent is that. Yeah, you can just keep going back to those colors when you're painting. So it's kind of the same principle as that, except it's just in values. We're just looking from black to white. Okay, and the reason we use black to white is because what we need to put into our story art is light. Light is so important when it comes to any kind of animation. So that's what we're going to start to do. So that's the Munsell value scale. If you've never imported brushes before, the way that you do it. Oh, I like to have this up. This is a personal preference thing, but I find if you do a lot of work in Photoshop, change your brush types to large list or to small list. I'll just click that. So I've got mine as large list. It's far easier to find a brush when you know what it's called than to have to look at the little preview things, because you just squint and you're like, I don't know, you think it's the right brush and actually it's not, because two of them have the same stamp and all of these sorts of problems. So it's quite nice to just get that up there. And then to import, you just go load brushes and then select that .abr file that I gave you. So what was it called? Winter 2012. It was that brush file. It's just a really nice, consistent set of brushes. I've got a lot of others. This is my actual brush set up here. But the Winter 2012 one, where did it start? I think it starts at normal pencil. It starts there. Yeah, the reason I like Winter 2012 because it's completely free, and most of them are stamp-based brushes. So what I mean by that is they're a singular image that then replicates itself as you draw with it. Now that's really nice because it means it uses less of the CPU and GPU of your computer. It's just more computer-friendly. Those weird, you know, the simulation brushes that do the weird tilty preview thing. Those things, unless you've got a really powerful machine, they just wreck your computer. They just slow everything down. It's really difficult to control them and to manipulate them. Stamp brushes, all the way. Much, much better. So, that being said, let's actually get into using some of these. So, I'm going to use... You can use anything in terms of brushes. Do what you like. You can use hard round for all I care. I'm not interested. I tend to use that paint one because it's just got a nice kind of feel to it. I also have a little bit of a tendency to just kind of play around with the way that brushes behave. So this is where I nerd out now. I like to have a slightly flattened brush. I don't know why. It just feels nice. Okay, that's my kind of preference when it comes to drawing. It's just flatten my brush down a little bit, so I don't have that kind of perfectly round shape. We're going to work. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call it comp_1. Just out of interest, does anyone know why it's a good idea to put underscores in file names?
Spaces.
Absolutely. Spaces can be misread, but also most computers still work in binary, and spaces don't. Sometimes machines get confused about what's a zero and what's a space. So not leaving a space prevents that error from happening, and it's just a good habit to get into, which is why you see, yeah, especially like developers, they put no spaces in their work. It's just everything's underscored. So I'll create a new layer called comp1, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go into this top frame and start to really think about, you know, how can I occupy this space? Now, just going back to, not to that, I want to go back to this. We were going to start with insolent cowards just here. So Frollo grabs another torch and touches the flame to the windmill. The entire structure is quickly engulfed. Engulfed is that word that really stands out. Now for me, I feel like if you want to see something be engulfed, you have to be able to see all of it. Like you can't, if you shoot something close up, like if it's a close, tight shot, how are you going to see that this windmill has, like, you know, gone up in flames enormously? You know, that's just, it's not going to work. So my brain's telling me that actually this shot needs to come out a little bit. It needs to show more of kind of the wider environment of what's happening. So let's go back to this. If I'm shooting if I'm thinking wide, I'm thinking of breaking something out and keeping it really open. My first instinct is to make something that has a relatively low horizon line. So I'm going to go for a line that's kind of here. You can see the lines are really scratchy at the moment. It's just loose. Yeah, something like that. So my other thought with this as well is I read the whole script. This is the other thing. Don't ever draw anything until you've read all the information, because you'll draw something and your director will go, well, that doesn't make sense. In a little while, there's a spaceship. You know, you have to know all of the content. Now, I know that on the next page, there's a bridge. Yeah, he rides off on a horse, and then he gets shot with an arrow, and he falls off the horse off the bridge. So that has to play into this as well. So I'm thinking if we've got kind of a relatively low composition here, I'm going to need to kind of bring it up slightly. And then I'm going to need to think about that bridge. So like that. So I've got kind of a so this is my foreground just here. This is foreground. This is my kind of background, and the top of my bridge is above my horizon line. And again, I'm keeping it very loose and sketchy at the moment. Now I know that I need a hill of some kind. And you have to, if I've set some kind of rules in terms of a bridge, I mean, how wide's a bridge? It's got to be what? I'm like putting myself in the universe here. If the bridge is 10 feet wide, or 12 feet wide, or let's go in meters. Let's say it's 3 meters wide. Okay, that's enough for 2 horses to go past. And based on my drawing, if that's 3 meters wide, it's probably 5 or 6 meters high. And a windmill is no more than 3 stories, so that's not going to be more than about 12 meters at the very most, maybe up to 15 meters. So the top of my windmill can't really come any higher than about there. So I'm by decoding the reality of the environment. So I'm not thinking about it like a painting. I'm thinking about it like a real place. This real place can't have any inconsistencies in shape and scale. If a bridge is this big, a windmill is that big, which means a horse is this big. You know, everything relates to one another. So as I go through, I'm kind of processing that information. I think it'd be really cool to kind of keep it relatively traditional looking. So I'm just going to put in some kind of basic lines for a windmill. Also, everyone does this with a windmill, and that's so boring. So I think it's going to have to be like a side-on thing. I think we're going to kind of go that way with it. I have got a rationale for this, by the way. There is a reason why I'm going this way. So I'm going side-on with my windmill, and again, it's all very rough and loose at the moment. Now, I've made a couple of very distinct decisions here, and I'm just going to bring up the rulers so you can see what I mean. Let's just move that. Just going to bring in a couple of guidelines to break this image apart. Go away. Let's zoom out. What I'm doing is I'm just bringing in a couple of guides to show you how this shot divides up into thirds. There we go. Guides are really helpful to kind of explain to yourself where your errors are. If something doesn't look right, drag some guides in from the rulers at the edge, and it will normally it will at least give you some indication of where the error might be. So the windmill going up in flames, that's super, super important. You know, that's a real kind of key moment. But I need to make sure that I'm not creating a composition that looks strange. If it's important, it needs to be really evident and visible in the shot. So it's got to be somewhere near the center. There's no point in drawing some tiny little windmill down here that no one can see. It's got to be present. However, if you put anything dead center of a shot, it creates symmetry. That you kind of cut a shot in half and you create like symmetry of two halves. And that's generally bad practice. Okay, I'm trying to remember who said it. There was a painter that said that true beauty is asymmetry. And I think that kind of applies to this. Like if something's asymmetrical, if it's weighted one side or another, it's generally more appealing. And you can see that when you look at filmmakers like Stanley Kubrick as an example. Stanley Kubrick uses loads of parallel symmetrical shots with center vanishing points and center horizon lines. And he does that purely to make people feel uncomfortable. That's the whole point, is to make people kind of feel taken back by what they're seeing. So if that works, then surely the opposite has the opposite effect. Yeah? Asymmetry would build a level of familiarity and comfort. So what I've done here is where I've kind of sketched that windmill in, I'm making a clear decision that I want it to be important. I want it to be the focal point. But actually, I need to offset it. It needs to feel kind of asymmetrical. I don't want it to be kind of this dominant element. Next thing we got to think about is those are what we call our local objects. So these are physical objects that exist in the space. A windmill, the floor. You'd be surprised how many people draw storyboards without any sense of where the floor is. Just kind of bodies floating in a frame, right? So yeah, I've established where the floor is, where the sky is, where the bridge is, because that's a narrative component, and where the windmill is, roughly. But there's something else in this that's really important that I need to give consideration to. And it's this word engulfed. Fire. I need to think about, this building is now on fire. So how would I translate that into a shot in a way that makes it feel dramatic? And what I need to do is actually think about going those principal rules of like grouping and rhythm and balance. How can I bring those into this? For me, everything in this shot feels like it's going in a very specific direction. I'm just going to change my brush into something like really bold and hideous. There we go. That's lovely. Perfectly hideous. Let's make this just a little bit smaller. So I've drawn lines that all kind of flow in one direction. So this kind of flows down that way. It's a little bit bigger. And then I've got this kind of hillside that, again, that's kind of flowing that way. And then I've got the bridge as well. The bridge is kind of going off into the distance. So it's kind of got this weird kind of, it's kind of flowing like that way, like off that way. So everything's kind of moving like left to right in one way or another. So it feels like this is kind of the high point of the shot, and things are either moving downwards that way or downwards this way. So I think I need to keep that rhythm going. It would make no sense at the moment if I were to just kind of do smoke like this. Oh, fire. All right, that's really bad smoke. But you get the idea. Like, if all the rhythm is moving like that across a shot, why would you draw an object that just goes straight up? It doesn't fit. It doesn't kind of make sense. I think what would look far better is to keep this rhythm going. So I quite like the idea of kind of enveloping this in flame, but bringing it all back that way. So that what we effectively have is this huge plume of smoke. So that all of this area here basically becomes enveloped in smoke. So it's going to keep that kind of same rhythm. It also gives an inclination of which way the wind is blowing, which I know seems like a little bit of a weird thing to consider. Like, you're just doing a comp painting. Who cares about the wind? Well, it does kind of matter, because the wind will affect the smoke, and the smoke will fill the shot. So you need to think about these kind of things. So that's what I'm going to go for. Is I'm going to try and maybe angle that so that everything flows in that direction. Okay, so I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes now, just 3 or 4 minutes to just start. I mean, look at this. It's ugly. Draw ugly. Drawing ugly is absolutely fine at this stage. Okay, but just kind of plot this in. Think about the idea. Break it into thirds. Get your floor in, start to draw in roughly where you think the windmill is. You can go the other way round, or if you can see it differently in your head, do it differently. But what I want you to do is just to put in some very kind of clear but lines. So just clear and rough, of kind of approximately where things are. Then we're going to look at using some more advanced tools like the lasso tool and stuff to really plant in kind of where light is and start using that the Munsell value scale to actually make it make sense. Because at the moment, that's hideous. So right, 5 minutes, yeah, load the file up, just sketch in roughly where things are, and then we'll take it from there. Okay, right. So this was, if I go back to my layers, that was the kind of plan. I was thinking, I want some kind of rhythm, going to kind of group objects together as best I can, but I really like the idea of everything feeling almost like it's moving in one direction, or at least along one plane of direction. So I put down the green kind of sketches and doodles, and then I went back and kind of refined the sketch a little bit, cleaned it up in order to really emphasize that point. So a couple of things I did. First off, I tried to think about smoke. This is another thing that I think is really important. When we're doing any kind of design, we have to get the balance right between the energy that we put into actually making marks and creating, and the energy that we put into processing the challenge in front of us. Good design is 80% thinking and only 20% doing. So I genuinely have just sat here and tried to go back in my mind and think about every instance that I can recall where I've seen something large on fire. Like, how does smoke behave? Like, what does it do? What are the physics of this material? So one of the things that first popped into my mind is that smoke is particles of burnt material that are pushed up into the air via combustion. So something's combusting and it's pushing those particles upward. But they are still kind of heavier predominantly than the atmosphere itself. So they clump together. So smoke, especially from burning wood like this, it wouldn't just dissipate up into the air like you're cooking spaghetti bolognese. Like, it wouldn't be like steam that just floats into nothing. Smoke is dense. It's going to pack together and it's going to hold its form really tightly and kind of almost force its way up through the air. Yeah, it might expand along the way as it cools. It's going to expand slightly, but it's going to kind of hold that form. So that was my first thought, is actually I want to get a really detailed, let's pull up my cursor, a really kind of detailed outline on that smoke. I don't want it to be all kind of floaty and thin. All right, we're going to get really thick. My other thought was, well, how does a windmill burn? Like, where would it catch? How would the smoke move through that object? So I thought, well, I can't imagine that it's going to burn perfectly from bottom to top. It's a cylinder. Heat rises, so the heat's going to the flame's going to catch at the bottom, but before the outside's caught fire, the inside's going to go up really quickly, especially if it's full of flour. If it's that kind of mill, flour is super combustible, so it's going to go straight up through the middle. So then I'm thinking, well, yeah, let's avoid any flames at the bottom because that's boring. Let's try and focus it to the top, the escape point. And then I'm thinking, well, how would it navigate around the blades of the windmill? How would that work? And I was thinking, well, let's make it three-dimensional. Let's perhaps have it in front of half of the blades and behind the other half. So it's kind of passing out through. Then I'm thinking, well, we've also got the atmospheric side of this as well. So that if the wind's blowing, which it must be because the smoke's moving in a direction, which way is it blowing? So I made a kind of executive decision, and it really comes down to how we think about depth and how we think about our shots. So I'm just going to pull up that lovely green again. There it is. And when we think about depth of an object, as animators, we do have a tendency, get to the right layer, we do have a tendency to think about things flat. We tend to think like up, down, left and right. You know, everything's X and Y axis, and we lose sight of the Z axis. So I thought, if I'm going to play with an object that's going to be affected by the wind, maybe this is a good opportunity to play with a Z-axis. So instead of the wind kind of going that way, or anything in between, I kind of followed the flow that was happening here with the bridge. So instead I've got the wind is kind of blowing like kind of backwards into the shot. So it's kind of going that way. Yeah, I want to push back into the shot. And what that's going to do is, by having the wind blowing that way, it's going to expose the front part of the mill. So we can still see that it's a mill. So from a viewer's perspective, we can look at that and go, oh, I completely understand what's happening. That's the building we just saw a close-up of with the people outside. And now it's on fire and the wind's kind of blowing up into the air. You know, the wind's blowing and it's catching the smoke and it's all horrible. So I'm really putting some deep thought processes into the design. So my next step is, if these are my lines and these are the forms that I'm going to work with, now I need to start making some decisions about light and the way that light is going to kind of behave within this. So I've created a new layer. I'm going to put this layer below my line art, and I'm going to start using the lasso tool. Has anyone used the lasso tool before? Yeah, the lasso tool is your friend. It allows you to create content really fast, and it allows you to be really kind of experimental and quite loose. I'm sure I showed people last year some artists who paint only with the lasso tool. They just create entire compositions. Now, there's some great stuff. Armand Serrano is a good example of an artist, pure lasso tool work, and it's fantastic. So with the lasso tool, I'm going to start thinking about kind of cutting objects out and placing emphasis. And I'm going to start from the background to the foreground. So I'm actually going to cheat and use the marquee for this. Smoke absorbs light. It is a dense object. Light cannot pass through smoke with any great level of ease, especially smoke from a burning building. It's going to be almost black. It's going to be really, really dense. Now, if I want to amplify that feeling and that kind of meaning of dense smoke, I need to think carefully about what I do behind that smoke. Okay, what can I do in terms of the way that light is behaving in order to maximize the effectiveness of that? And what I'm thinking is I'm going to kind of cheat a little bit. I'm going to use the gradient tool. We're kind of there actually with the two color setup. I'm going to go black to white. Actually, no, I'm not. That's not going to work at all. I think it might be better. Let's go to. There it is. It might be better to not go to like perfect black, but to kind of go somewhere in between. So let's try that. That's close. It's not quite there. Let's go to this one. So what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of playing around with the colours a little bit, trying to keep it desaturated. That green is too green. So I'm just trying to find an area where it's completely desaturated, bring it up a little bit. I don't want perfect black. That's it. So what I'm going to do here is if this is going to be dark, then it kind of makes sense to light it this way. Maybe slightly upward. Again, I'm thinking about the same kind of balance that I achieved. That's good. Stretch that out. When I get it the way I want it to look, I'll stop. But it is an iterative process. And what I'm doing, can you notice that the line I'm using is very much kind of in line with the way that everything's moving in the shot. I'm trying to keep that kind of same movement. So I cheated a little bit there with the gradient tool, but again, it's just to quickly build the right feeling. So that's kind of working nicely. Now I'm going to go in with the lasso tool and start to cut out the key components. So my smoke, for example, you can get really kind of intricate with this if you want to, or you can just do it fast and loose. So I'm going to keep this relatively loose at the moment. I'm trying to keep to my lines as best I can. Once you step outside the frame, obviously cheat. Okay, so there's my first line. Go back to my brush tool. It's down to you how you want to do this. You can work across multiple layers. Or you can just work across one layer at a time. I'm going to go for almost black, but not quite. So down to the 35, 40 mark. And then I'm just going to throw this in like this. So for now, just kind of working with that. Then I'll go into my buildings and go, okay, let's get the buildings kind of mapped out. And again, I'm going to do this super quick. That needs to come out a little bit there. If you've not used the lasso tool at any great length before, Shift and Alt are your friends. They allow you to quickly grab content. So I want to make sure I'm definitely going to work on the right layer here. What I don't want to do, what I don't want to do is cross layers over and start making kind of silly mistakes. where you can, you want to keep it relatively sensible. So, and just slightly above grey, but not perfectly, and get some colour into that. So already I'm starting to build a little bit of identity. But what I'm going to do now is keep working into this with just what we call local colours. So I'm not thinking about light just yet. I'm just kind of building these basic prints. So I'm kind of jumping back and forth between being someone who's thinking three-dimensionally and about a physical space, but also someone who's thinking about a very kind of flat object. So another thing that I'm thinking, if the light is behind, because we've established that by having it really pale up here, that means that these objects down here on the ground will be in, at least partially, in shadow. So I'm going to grab this little space here, I'm going to grab that bit, and I'm going to come up here a little bit as well. So this area just here is going to be partially in shadow, but not completely. So I'm going to go for a slightly darker. So, and then I might even just go back over this. I don't want to get too painterly at the moment, but I'm going to make this bottom half even darker. So you can see I'm not using the gradient tool or anything here. I'm actually just using a brush, starting to build that in. And then here's the same. So it's going to be quite light towards the edges because the top of the hill is going to catch. A little bit higher. Yeah, the top of the hill is going to catch the sunlight. So it's really only the bottom, like this, that's really going to be kind of greyed out. Maybe a little bit darker here. So just starting to kind of build those local colours roughly. So if you want to make a start on this, you can see we're still working rough. You're just using the lasso tool to grab sections, start to pull it out, start to give it a bit of depth and you know, density. Okay, so you've got, should we say 15 minutes? So until 11:30, see how much of this you can quickly sketch out, grab the lasso tool and start to fill out as best you can. Okay, and then we'll reconvene. back on. Yeah, I'm just going to do a quick walk back over what I was doing whilst you were sketching out and kind of mapping the basic design. I was going through a process of trying to figure out particularly how light is behaving in terms of composition. It's light and line together that will help this make sense. Okay, if we don't have the two in unison, there's going to be conflict there somewhere. So it was really just working through and thinking, okay, you know, if I've got this huge kind of dark patch that's extending and expanding out from one point outward across the top left side of the frame, where is the light, and where are the primary light sources and how kind of behaving? So we know that we've set one in the background because we needed it in order to make the smoke work. We had to go for a kind of either sunrise or sunset or some kind of, you know, low angle on the light source. That's fine. But then we also have another light source in there, which is the fire itself. So even though the smoke is black and dense, it is made of particles, some particles that will reflect light. So you need to think about that as well. If you've got this, and flame, you know, fire has a really high luminosity rate, especially if it's burning wood. Well, it has a very, very high luminosity rate. So the light that's coming off of that flame is going to head straight upwards or out all directions, really. But as it heads upward, it's going to hit the underside of the smoke, and it's actually going to create some variation. You're not just going to get a singular black silhouette of smoke. You're going to get a little bit of texture and a little bit of difference within it because of the way that the light is behaving. So the way I tackled that, let's get rid of that. Let's just go to this layer. So I'm just going to remove kind of all the unnecessary stuff at the moment. This is what I attempted to do. So I took the lasso tool and I made my first outline. And oh, sorry, you can't see that. I promise it will look better on YouTube. What I did with this is I just went in with the lasso tool and just started making marks and kind of squiggling in areas where I thought the light was going to hit. So there was some kind of obvious ones. So for example, on the edge of the smoke just here, because you've got light behind, that's going to catch the edge of that smoke. So you're going to get just a little bit of variation there. Down here, the closer you get to the source of ignitions, the actual fire itself, you're going to get more light kind of bouncing off. And then up here, if I'm honest, it was very much sort of at random. Sorry, just accidentally close it. Very much at random. I just kind of made up little squiggles, patterns, where I just added darker patches with the brush tool. So just sort of lower values. And one of the things that kind of helps this work a little bit better is if you're afraid to go over the top of yourself with the lasso tool. Just because you've done a lasso doesn't mean that that's its own shape and you can't go over it with another texture. Just cross them over and kind of do it very much at random. I mean, ultimately, we've got to remember that we are just creating a composition design. It's not full painting. It's really just about knowing where everything is for this shot. And then over the top of that, because again, I'm thinking, well, I want it to feel like there's emphasis is on the windmill. So I want it to be really well lit around the windmill because that's the focus. So I added a gradient. So I took the outside line of this, the outside silhouette, using the lasso and the select tool. And then over the top of it, I just added a very kind of pale gradient. So darker up here, lighter down here. And then the two together kind of build that feeling. So there's my bottom gradient. There's the kind of local gradients that I'm adding in. And there's the really rough line work over the top. But together, we're now beginning to see that it does make sense. You know, I've got patches of light here for smoke, fire breaking through, a little bit of fire right at the back of the blades, some indication of fire down here because I've added a little white splodge. Now, in terms of compositional design, as a story artist, probably don't need much more than this. Like, we get it. Like, you can look at that and go, oh, I get it. It's on fire and the smoke's going to go that way. So the FX artists are going to have their work cut out for them doing, because that smoke's obviously going to move as it, you know, it's going to be animated and move upward. So they know roughly the direction it's going to move in. For the storyboard artist and for the director, there's some indication of what you could do with the shot. So one of the really common things you see a lot of story artists do when they're doing this kind of composition is to actually sketch outward, so draw beyond this. So they'll keep going kind of all the way out. They're kind of sketching. Yeah, they'll sketch all the way out here and draw in like the path or whatever it might be, and start drawing like the people on horses or whatever's kind of happening in the shot. That's a really dodgy horse. I promise you I'm going to draw a better horse in a little while. So yeah, they'll kind of sketch all the way out of the shot so that they can kind of then show the director that it doesn't have to be static. We could add like a camera movement in here, like a really kind of subtle movement. You know, the horse is kind of walking away and then the shot kind of tracks or pans to the left and there's this huge column of smoke going up into the sky and there's fire and stuff like that. So you can sketch outside of it if you want to. But as far as composition goes, that's fine. So I want to give you sort of time to actually tackle this and really get the idea of light and what's happening with the light drawn in with the lasso tool. So we're going to go to 12 o'clock with that. Then we're going to tackle another one of the pieces that we pulled out from the script, but one that's character-led. So we can look at how would you know, let's talk about framing characters in terms of story design. So you've got until 12 o'clock now to tackle just this one and get the light as you want it. Think about that density of smoke, you know, how can you kind of get it looking like it's got real depth to it. And also what's going to happen with light on the building itself. Okay, so yeah, 20 minutes until 12 o'clock, and then we're going to move down to this frame and look at a character piece. And yeah, how could we frame one of those? And yeah, save your work, please, 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 please save your work. So yeah, I'm going to turn this off and take a break. So.